How's it going, chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. I am very, very excited to bring you the next installment in the Absinthe series of podcasts. If you haven't checked out the previous videos and podcasts, I suggest you do so because there's a whole lot of context that's going to make this video a whole lot more enjoyable for you. So initially, set in roughly the 1700s, we looked at the transition of absinthe from being a hedge witch's medicinal tincture over to kind of becoming the commercial product we think of as absinthe today. Fast forward about 100 years, and we're looking at our second set of videos and podcasts focusing on absinthe completely and utterly taking over the French cafe culture as the drink of choice, and the wine industry's very controversial response to that. For today's podcast, we're going to be jumping forward from that a little bit in time and focusing on what happens when the world decides that absinthe is evil and it should be shut down. Spoiler alert, they damn near killed absinthe. It almost disappeared. But what they actually did was make it stronger. They saved absinthe. That's what today's podcast is about. And to set the stage, I think I really need to introduce today's guests. Actually, let's face it, for this series especially, he's not a guest, he's a co-host. Some say that he doesn't need to make cuts because in his presence, hearts just know where to go. And he once discovered the secret to fermenting concrete, but quickly discarded it because the spirit was just too soft. The host, the owner of One Piece at a Time Distilling channel here on YouTube, and the author of Distillers Almanac, host for If You Have Ghosts, You Have Anything, and Distillers Talk. Of course, we're talking about
Alan Bishop. We're back. It's damn good to be talking to you again, mate. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm great. I sound a little froggy because I've had a little bit of the what we call the Ohio Valley crud going on, but I'm good otherwise, I believe. So nothing
That's awesome
strange,
to hear, man.
Strange is falling off or anything of that nature. So I think we're okay.
Awesome. Hey, a little birdie tells me, and that little birdie was you, but I figured you probably wouldn't bring it up, so I will. You just won an award for an absinthe against some pretty stiff competition, man. What was the deal with that?
So that is excuse me, that's an absinthe that I did I designed for my friend Jim at Key West Trading down in Key West, Florida. And so, I didn't have an outlet for a real Belle Epoque style absinthe at Spirits of French Lick. So Jim and I have been good friends for a couple of years. I really like Jim. He is he's a personality. If you ever meet him, anybody that lives in Key West is a personality, just to be clear. But he'll laugh at this. I needed new gutters on my house and he needed an absinthe. So we came to an agreement. So
how good is that?
Yeah. I got new gutters. He got an absinthe, and we talk back and forth, and we have plans for like maybe that business will get big enough that there'll be some actual profit sharing and stuff like that in the future. We'll see. He is expanding pretty rapidly. I've done I think 3 absinthes for him. There's only 1 released so far, but he also has an absinthe house in Key West, and he's opening one in New Orleans. So we talk back and forth on absinthe quite a bit, but I didn't realize Jim has a bad habit of doing things and then he doesn't say anything about it. So he entered it in several competitions, and it won a couple little things that I wasn't really thinking much about. And then it won a competition where it took 3, I don't even remember what they were, but it was like best in show. And then there were 2 other like gold medals against Ted Bro from Jade Liqueurs. So I very rarely do I pat myself on the back, but I was like, yeah, you did okay there, buddy.
Take that one.
Right? The guy who re-legalized it for all of us, we beat him. It may never happen again. And I love Ted. I should also mention that his Edouard absinthe is by far my favorite commercially available wide-scale absinthe in the world. So that was pretty cool. And I didn't expect it. I wish I'd been there to see the whole thing. And I don't know. I told Jim when I come back to Key West, I'm taking one of those trophies. I don't care if he wants to show them off or not. One of those is mine. It's coming home with me.
How good. Oh, that's awesome, man. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I was pretty enthralled by that. That's so competitions are one thing and judging is another thing, but when it's against somebody that you know is legitimate, like, and really, really good at what they do and probably the world's foremost expert on something, and then to come out on top, yeah, that's meaningful.
For everyone listening, what's the name of the bottle? And is it available anywhere but like the distillery? Is it distributed at all?
So that is the Death in the Afternoon Absinthe from Key West Trading Company. Of course, inspired by Hemingway, who had a home there on Key West. And a great quote about Key West and absinthe that he had years ago. But so I think it is now in distribution in Florida. I know they're talking, and this is where I need to talk to Jim. I know they're talking distribution in other states, definitely Louisiana. But other than that, I don't know for sure. I know there was some talk about some online retail too. The big problem is getting him to scale with production, because when you're doing a real absinthe like that, as we've talked about before, it's solid state distillation almost. So finding craft distillers who will do that and have the equipment to do it on scale is difficult. I mean, just even the idea of having to bruise and macerate that amount of botanicals, not to mention getting it back out of the still once it's in there, that's a whole nother ball game. So it's out there, very limited distribution, but if you can find it, definitely try it. It's a true Belle Epoque style absinthe. It's very much sort of the aperitif digestif style of absinthe, where we're using the botanicals to trick you into thinking that it's food, not alcohol, and it works. It works very well. So, as evidenced by the fact that I do not have any of it left here at the house. Jim, if you listen to this, I need some absinthe bottles and a trophy, buddy.
Hook a brother up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
and a pat on the back from you too, Jim.
Yeah, for sure. Something.
A self pat doesn't quite cut it.
He sent me photos of him with the awards and standing next to Ted, and I was like, I just had the moment of like, there's very few moments in the industry after a while because you get jaded, but just that moment of fuck yeah, that happened. That's a thing. So.
Yeah, dude, that's awesome. It is weird how it doesn't matter what you're doing, right? Like anything you're doing, this kind of. You first start out and it's really hard, but the gains you make are huge, like both in terms of knowledge and improvement and skill and accolades and anything. And then it just kind of plateaus out and just feels like just normal, like even if you do have a product that goes well or you win a competition, or this is the same with sport or anything. And then something comes along that actually pushes you, and it's a nice feeling to kind of regain that. At least the emotional state of what it was like when you first started, right?
I was having a conversation about that the other day when somebody had asked me about, what it's like to restart again, right? With this whole distilling thing, because I built my reputation on French lick and all that stuff. And they were asking about competitions specifically. And I think I got super jaded for a few reasons. And also, your ego can get out of control too. That's the other thing, right? And so you start expecting things. But I think being so close to Kentucky and being in that bourbon centric zone, like I just got to a point where like the competitions just became almost meaningless to me in a lot of ways. Like, don't get me wrong. Like if somebody that's a big name, like says something about you and they think what you're doing is cool, or they really like what you're doing, and that it's honest. You've not accusing anybody. You've not paid anybody to do this.
Yeah.
It's awesome. But then there's also that thing that happens after the first time it happens, when you start getting that traction of like, then every year when that comes back around, you're sitting there with like your fingers crossed, like, oh damn, if I don't get it again, then have I lost my touch? Or, and
yeah,
it's not good for you mentally to be in that state. And I was definitely in that state. And I think that again, that does have a lot to do with being like in bourbon territory, because it's everywhere all the time. You're not having conversations with a whole lot of people that aren't involved in that in some way, shape, or form. So, and to be honest with you, the bourbon thing's not that difficult. So the absinthe thing to me has a little more meaning to it. So But
yeah, fair, man. I can understand that for sure. Yeah, it is interesting too, isn't it? Because the bourbon is so much more ingrained in everything compared to absinthe.
Right.
Like the general person on the street doesn't know absinthe from ouzo.
No. And absinthe is definitely to alcohol, it is what Bill Hicks was to comedy. Give me a room with 100 people in it, and I will get it down to one.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, man.
I promise you, team, Alan and I are going to get to the topic of today's podcast. I promise you. But I thought it was important to go over some of his accolades because, he totally deserves it. And in just a second, I'm going to get Alan to taste the last absinthe I made and see if I did a good job. Kind of nerve-wracking when you send a homemade absinthe to someone like Alan Bishop. But while you're here, I've got two things that I want to show you that aren't officially out yet, but I thought the hardcore crew that are listening to the full-length podcast should, be the ones to get at it first. Obviously, the Patreons and the mailing list already know about this. Two things. Number one, the new Chase the Craft coin is here. If you want to see what this thing is all about, the ideas behind it, you can read about it at chasethecraft.com or catch the next video that'll be coming out that will involve it. And number two, you've probably spotted it already, the new absinthe shirt from Into the AM is here. It's dope. There is a link in the description down below to get 10% off, and there is a bunch of Easter eggs in it. See if you can catch the Alan Bishop reference. Back to the podcast.
Speaking of absinthe, and I should say too, now that we're 10 minutes into the podcast, team, we're here to do the next episode in the line of episodes where we're talking about the history of absinthe and kind of picking out key historical styles of absinthe and where they fit into the story of absinthe overall. So we're going to get onto that for a second, but we're just hanging in and having a chat for a few minutes here. And part of that is the last absinthe I made, which was not one of the historical absinthes. It was a bastardization out of Jesse's head. I managed to get a sample to Alan, so I don't think he's tasted this yet, and I definitely haven't had any feedback from him. So give it to us raw, dude. Feel free to say whatever you want, because like I said, this is version 1.0 of something I'm working on, so you ain't going to hurt my feelings. Let me know what you think.
So the one thing that I love about this in particular is I know that where you are geographically, you don't necessarily always have access to like the best of the best botanicals at your doorstep when it comes to absinthe botanicals. And yet you still managed on the nose to nail absinthe on the nose while also bringing a little something different, but still interrelated to the medicinal history of absinthe to the nose as well. So it's not, you definitely didn't go Belle Epoque. Like even if you intended to go somewhat Belle Epoque, you definitely went a little bit more on the nose of that Swiss style because that wormwood is a little more prominent. But I am a fan of bitters. Yeah. I wish more people understood, as Alan Bishop, the alchemist, not distiller, I wish more people understood the importance of those bitters, especially in health. But here on the nose, like I can get that the anise and fennel sort of notes are there, but that wormwood just kicks up. Like it's got that one high note there that almost goes fruity to some degree, but you can tell there's that bitterness there, and your brain recognizes it. So great job on the aromatics, especially for using the botanicals that you have access to. And what's the proof on this?
60.
60. Okay. Good. I ain't that scared then. I was afraid it was going to be way up there. Man. So really great mouthfeel on that. Nice coating, and it lingers, and that's with no water. I've not looshed anything here. But you could drink it. Almost the mouthfeel that you get out of this almost comes off like some of the old liqueurs that would be like, very, very small amount of like simple syrup, right? Chartreuse, if it weren't just a sugar bomb.
Yeah, it's quite thick, isn't it?
Yeah, very thick for what it is. The wormwood's there, but it's not overly bitter. It doesn't make you clench up in any way, shape, or form. It definitely, I get the sweetness right down the middle and all the way to the very back. that anise note is there, but it's subdued a little bit. And then there's also a really high note that my brain wants to say, and I don't get it on the aroma, but my brain on the palate wants to say citrus of some sort, but I don't get it on the aroma necessarily. But one really nice, bright, almost fruity note that really spreads across the front of the palate and then down the sides on this initial intake. So that you have done a great job, because most absinthes are not drinkable at proof, right, without lushing. So this one could potentially get someone in trouble for sure. So
to give you, I don't think I've even told you what it is yet, have I? Like what the plan was.
No.
So after making the two historical, the 1700s and the 1800s absinthe that you helped me make,
yeah,
I loved the herbal, bitter nature of the 1700s absinthe.
Yep.
And the more kind of savory presentation rather than dessert.
Right.
But I love the mouth coating thickness of the French 1800s absinthe. So the plan was to kind of pair those two together, have the heartiness of the 1800s French absinthe, but the more wormwood forward aspect of the earlier absinthe. And then to kind of make it my own, I added a little bit of smoke. So there's a small amount of New Zealand peat in there. It's probably a little bit more subdued than I'd hoped for, but if you go looking for it, you can find it.
Like I think at high proof it was, but once I added some water to it and I looshed it down, then not so much on the nose, but definitely on the palate, like just a little. Not enough to turn someone off that doesn't like smoke. I mean, it's just there as a beneficiary note to everything else, really.
It's less cigar ashy. It's less Lafroig, more Ardbeg, I guess, but it takes it even more in that it's kind of composty, like leaf litter, rot, sweet, hay mulch more. Which I really like. There's also a metric shit ton of yerba mate in there. And the idea there was, I loved the idea of kind of that lucid intoxication. And I figured what better way to add to that than trying to figure out a way to crowbar a bunch of caffeine in there, especially yerba mate, because that's how people describe the yerba mate high compared to a coffee, as more focused, less jittery, more like just as much up, but more calm.
And it fits right into everything else. That fits right into everything else that's going on in there too, as far as the notes. Like that works extremely, extremely well. I love once I looshed it down. So a couple of things. So it isn't a real heavy loosh, but that's okay too. So ironically, we're going to be talking about the Swiss style tonight. So a lot of times the Swiss styles don't, they don't loosh as heavy, and they don't, or as they say, they don't squint as heavy. And that little bit of smoky note that is there. And to be fair, I'm not drinking out of a regulated absinthe glass. I'm drinking out of a Whiskey Witch Nation glass. But that little bit of smoke that is there, right? I do that all the time too. That little bit of acrid smoke on the finish is perfect with that wormwood. Because that wormwood has the herbal, medicinal, bitter note, but that smoke kind of elevates it in a really unique way. Because you're right, it is kind of a fall of the year sort of leaf mold sort of thing. And by the way, I also really like the color of this. So I think it's got a really cool color.
I left it in it had the most intense green color I've ever seen on anything that hasn't had food dye in it. And then I left it, and I mean, it makes sense with all the yerba mate, right? I put all the yerba mate in after distillation. And then I left it in a clear bottle in the shed for 2 days. So it went straight to brown in like 2 days.
I think it fits that though. I mean, like you couldn't have sent a more perfect absinthe for the time of year it is here in the US, being October and the leaves have changed and all that stuff. I mean, that is an excellent absinthe for this time of the year. The other thing, you got just enough anise in there that I get the anethol reaction. I didn't get it immediately. Like you normally tip of the tongue starts to go numb. Here, I get middle of the tongue and across, and it's only after a few drinks. Which to me, that's actually one of the most pleasing things about the sensory factors of absinthe is that anethol, that numbness that you kind of get from having a drink or two of absinthe. There's something about that I love. It gives me the warm fuzzies. So.
Yeah, dude, I know what you mean. And it kind of adds to the, maybe it's just a weird association in my head, but it kind of adds to the sweetness of it. It feels sweet. It feels like there's something really syrupy sitting on your tongue.
I always think of
which
it as
I love, but
like almost like confectioner's sugar, like powdered sugar. That's what it always makes me think of. So
yeah, or like icing, like a cream cheese icing, kind of velvety. Yeah.
Yep.
And so it's funny, like in the French 1800s, what's that, Belle Epoque absinthe, I enjoyed that, but because it was so sweet,
it's a lot.
It tasted like something that, okay, we've had dinner, I'll have one.
Right.
And I'll love it, but then I do not want more.
No more. Yep. that's how the Jade Edouard is. It's so heavy. You have one and you're good. Let's go to bed. That's it. Yeah. You're going to sleep now. So
the plan was to still get that feeling and that heaviness, but then push the balance way savory. And that, so a shitload more wormwood. The yerba mate is kind of that green tea flavor. Reminds me of, eating yum cha and drinking green tea or, that's almost a savory product to me, even if you're just drinking it by itself, not a sweet product. And then the same with the smoke to try and push it that way.
Well,
sorry, man, I cut you off.
Oh, you're good. You're good. Even in terms of, so you can tell I haven't been doing tours because I've forgotten the cadence of talking to people. So, but even in terms of that savory note, and there's still sweetness here, right? But it's perceived sweetness. There's nothing there to make it sweet. It's just perceived sweetness. That absinthe doesn't need any sugar at all. Not for sweetness and not for mouthfeel. It's perfect the way it is as far as just pour that as a neat spirit and enjoy it. There's nothing faulty about it. There's nothing off about it. I will also say this. So one place where, and distillers make this mistake, I think a lot of times in general, one place where people make mistakes in distillation it's not even in the technicalities. It's in their approach to a spirit, right? It's in this has to be made a certain way. It has to be perfect. It has to be this. It has to be that. And there a lot of nowadays home distillers, thanks to channels like yours and others out there, are really, really good at that. But where they mess up is they don't understand the approach, right? And the approach is, what is it that you're really trying to do? Are you trying to accomplish something for yourself or for somebody else? So the approach here is,
I see what you mean.
Yeah, you use the yerba mate. You made this your own thing, but it's true to the tradition of absinthe in that medicinal sort of sense, right? So the approach is ideal. And as far as being an alternative style of absinthe like this, I have a really good buddy, Ron Rupert, who's an excellent absinthe maker. He, I can't remember what he put in there, but he did like an Indian inspired absinthe. So out of the alternative absinthes that I've had, those two, that's perfect, man. If there was a New Zealand style of absinthe, you have nailed it. It is a thing.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. That's very high praise coming from you. Have you got anything you think I should tweak with it? Does anything stand out as, it's okay, but if you did this? Or do you think that falls into that? Because I'll be honest, dude, this was very much in the vein of fuck everyone else. This is what I want.
Right. If I was going to add something to that to make it any more like savory, but also to allow those sweet notes to remain, I might really pump some angelica seed to it.
Okay.
And I might
that earthy sort of.
Yeah. For shits and giggles with that smoke, and this is going to be a weird one, but grapefruit peel would be kind of interesting. Because that smoke has that little bit of acrid up front, but if you could get one high note sort of pushing that along, that would take it over the top, I think.
So it did have a small amount of angelica seed in it.
Mm-hmm.
For reference, it was 2 liters of spirit and 90 grams of wormwood.
Nice.
120 anise, 120 fennel, and there was only 5 grams of angelica seed. So I could probably 25 grams or something. I'd sort of bump that up.
And I'm surprised.
What about even angelica root?
Yeah, and as far as angelica root goes too, I mean that'll even thicken up the body of that much more. I mean that stuff will get real thick with angelica root. I'm surprised that you had that much wormwood in there for 2 liters. It was 92 liters. Okay, that makes sense. All right, that's not as much as I was thinking. I got to do the U.S. Conversion. So 90 is not that bad. So
I stole the amount of wormwood. I think it's pretty much the same as the 1700s recipe you gave me. Just prorated up or down. I can't remember which way it went. I could definitely see grapefruit working though, because as soon as you said it, I thought about the what do you call it? Scorched grapefruit peel as a garnish. That kind of, it's sweet, but it's bitter. It's got the savory. It doesn't taste savory, but it has a savory connotation to it. Right. Exactly. I guess in the way it's paired.
Here's another weird one that you might consider, and don't. It's going to sound really trite when I say it, but I think it could be interesting. This would be maybe even during the coloration step, and you'd want to wring it out pretty good so you're not wasting alcohol. But what about just like a hair little bit of like dried kiwi, right? Just a little
dried
of that
kiwi.
Yeah, to pull a little of that fruitiness there. Right. Because one of the reasons for using the petite wormwood in the coloration is because it has a little bit of a fruity sort of pop to it. So if you had something that was an actual fruit, like kiwi would have that sort of effect. Dried kiwi in particular, I think would be the key to it probably. And I don't think you'd want much, just a very small amount, like a little hint of it,
Yeah, I can see that. I still can't find petite wormwood. So I am using mugwort. Is that the right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. It's very hard, even in the US, to find petite. There used to be a great resource in Virginia that I could order from, but a distillery bought them out, and I can buy plants from Canada, but we've tried to grow petite wormwood here several times, and I can get it through a couple years. And if we have a wet year, though, it dies. It doesn't want anything to do with it. So it just becomes not worth the hassle to deal with it. That, or one year the ducks got in there and tore it up because they wanted to lay a nest there, and that became a whole issue. So start wondering how duck pairs with absinthe.
Yeah, dude. I imagine really freaking well. Mm-hmm. Hey, you know what I did try, man? I had this idea. My buddy is Meat Man. He was the CEO of a meat company. He's now going up on his own, and he was like, Jesse, you've got to make a. He was trying to. What was he trying to talk me into? He was trying to talk me into making like hot sauces, fermented hot sauces, or something like that, and kind of branding them. And I was like, okay, it's kind of cool. I was like, but what if we made a range of sauces, and every sauce had actual booze in it, and they were all based on a cocktail or a spirit, turn it into a holiday box kind of thing. Anyway, I ended up making I got to the point of trying them. I don't think it's going to happen. It just seems like a shitload of work that doesn't stick to my knitting, Right. But what I did try, dude, was an Alabama white sauce with a shitload of absinthe in it. Ooh. And holy crap, that slaps, man. Only on certain things. But duck, I reckon it would work on duck.
Yep. We do Tabasco peppers packed in. I'll pack them in either white vinegar or an apple cider vinegar that we make every year, and then I take Thai basil, which has anethol in it, so it's very similar to anise. And I don't put much, but 4 or 5 leaves in there, and then a couple black peppercorns, and then just let it set for a couple months. And I love it. I absolutely love it. It's great on meat. It's great on anything. Greens. I eat a lot of greens, collard greens and stuff like that, and it's phenomenal on collard greens.
That anethol flavor, I mean, I don't know, but I'm assuming star anise has anethol as well.
It does, yes.
Very similar.
Tremendous amount of anethol. Yeah.
Because there's something about star anise that, I mean, it just makes it delicious, but it also makes meat taste meatier.
Right.
especially red meat.
It's that contrast.
Like if you throw that into a chili or a stew to the point where you can't actually taste star anise, it's like putting MSG in there, man. So I could totally see the Thai basil doing the same thing.
Yeah, and I think I told you before on the star anise, like some of the producers, especially the French producers, like that was a big no. Like nope, or there were a few of them that would do star anise, but a lot of them they considered it like cheapening the product in some way, shape, or form. Like it was too candy.
Wait, sorry, what products are these?
Absinthe. Right. So,
okay.
French absinthe, basically. So there were several that did use it, but a lot of them thought of it as it cheapened it to them because they thought of it as more of a candy like tone as opposed to sort of like a pastry sort of tone. So,
and you're talking historically. Historically, that was the thinking. That's interesting. Yeah, man. Because if you've got anise, fennel, licorice root. Star anise just seems like it slots right in between all of those.
It does.
But I do get what you mean. It is a like sweeter, powdery, kind of flavor. Interesting. All right, dude. So let's get on to the half an hour in, the point of this show, which is to tell the next story in Absinthe. And for the sake of people, if they haven't listened to the other episodes, I 100% suggest you go back and listen to it because the knowledge Alan drops, both in terms of being able to make the spirit or understanding the spirit, is insane. But the historic context that kind of falls around it makes your enjoyment of absinthe way more intense, in my opinion, anyway. So, Alan, tell me if I'm wrong here, but basically where we got to was 1800s in France. Absinthe is starting to get popular. Phylloxera hits France and wipes out the wine industry. Absinthe takes its place in cafe culture, sort of hoity-toity circles. The iron root grape stock comes over from America and puts wine back on the map, but it takes them a little while to actually be able to grow grapes. When they've actually got product, they find that they've lost their market share to absinthe, so they do the typical thing you do in marketing. If you can't up your product, you slander the other product.
Right.
And created a whole mess of noise that still floats around in pop culture today, basically saying that absinthe's going to make you go mad, you're going to murder your family, you're going to lose everything you love because absinthe is the devil. And it gets to the point where people actually listen and that starts to spread around the whole world, basically. Absinthe is now enemy number one in spirits, and it starts to get outlawed everywhere. And I'm pretty sure that's where we left off. Does that sound about right? Have I messed anything up there?
Yep, that sounds about right to me.
Does it make sense to start this discussion? Well, actually, do you want to just for context, do you want to give people an idea of the style of absinthe that we're going to start talking about? So when we go through the kind of the history and the context of it, they've got something to hang their coat on.
Absolutely. So the style that we're going to be talking about is the Swiss Le Blue or the Blanche style, the colorless absinthe that was made clandestinely by bootleggers, what we might call moonshiners, etc. In the Swiss Alps in particular. It was illegal, but it was protected to some degree because it was considered a Swiss tradition, right? So you'd have to really have made a cop mad or done something real stupid to bring the law down on you for making absinthe in the Swiss Alps, for sure. So that's where we're going to be headed with this, and it's a little different style. One thing I should point out historically. So when we talked about the Belle Epoque, we also did talk about how there were. While most of the marketing against absinthe was outright lies, there were, just like there always are, bad producers. Just like the gin epidemic in England, etc. There were a lot of people throwing copper sulfate in to get color out of it, which is a heavy metal. They're running different grades of absinthe, so you might have absinthe extraordinaire, ordinaire, and then you'd have subgrades of absinthe, which would literally be made out of like the dregs of the botanicals that have gone through 2 or 3 distillations already. Just really rot gut stuff. And so for all of the unfortunate things that the ban did and all the mythology that the ban introduced, The one thing that it did manage to do when it goes back to the Swiss Alps and goes back to being an illicit product, or goes to being an illicit product, not back to, is it also kind of fixed absinthe in some ways, because now it's in the hands of true believers and people who've grown up with it and people who have always seen it as their own. And they're making it for their neighbors, and they're not going to poison their neighbors. They're not going to do anything to hurt their neighbors. So they're going to take a much more.
They're not trying to make a quick buck.
Exactly. They're going to take a much more high road sort of thing. And truthfully, I would be surprised at the scales that they were on, and the amount of botanicals that are going into any of these absinthes. They would have had a real hard time, especially once you realize where the alcohol was coming from. They'd have had a real hard time really making any money off this. This was, in my opinion, from what I've seen and read, this was a passion of a labor of love for these people. This wasn't even a money thing. This was nope. This is part of what we do. This is, the same as raising a pig and butchering a pig after industrialization. You don't have to do it to survive anymore, but it's part of what we do. So, and you should teach your children these things, because they may need to know them one day. So, that's very much where this is headed, and it becomes very much a sort of like, along with the roots of absinthe going back to the 1700s. It becomes you're out traveling through the mountain passes in the wintertime. There's a little cafe down there in the middle of nowhere serving some coffee, but I bet they also have a public absinthe fountain. This is no longer like you can look these things up; they're cool. It's no longer like the absinthe fountain that sits on the table. This thing looks like an old bubblegum dispensing machine that you put a quarter in, right? It's a big, huge fishbowl thing on a stand, and it's got, 15 outlets on it for everybody that's there in the cafe. So, yeah, it's a whole thing. They'd have been all about the yerba mate. Awesome. That would have been right up their alley. Who needs the coffee? We got the caffeine right there in the absinthe.
So, if we kind of jump back to France now, I guess we should have mentioned too that, I guess the best way to put it is France. It was funny, man, like seeing that episode I put out, 1800s French absinthe, and the amount of, oh, you dickhead, absinthe's not French. It's like, yeah, dude, but you've missed the point.
Right.
Now it is in the 1800s.
Yeah.
But there's a solid point to that, right? Like the French appropriated absinthe, but the heart of absinthe, the long tradition of absinthe, the cultural roots of absinthe was not French.
Right. Maybe even a better way to say it would be the Parisians appropriated absinthe, right? Because if you get up on the border, I don't know that even though they're in two different countries, I don't know that they would look at each other that way, right? They're all part of the Val de Traverse sort of thing. So, but yeah, definitely the Parisians and the industrialists, the ones who were allowed to make things as such, certainly appropriated it.
Well, actually, do you want to just sort of tell the story of, okay, so now the wine industry has basically convinced the world that absinthe's evil. What kind of happened from there to shut it down?
So the ban doesn't all happen at one time. It stretches over a number of years across, various countries. And I should say that in Spain, it was never made illegal. So your red absinthe,
Spaniards
that is,
don't give a fuck.
Well, that was the last outpost of the Knights Templar as well. So that makes sense, right? Here's, at least one little liberal outpost here. So, is where you would expect to find it, but that's also where your red absinthe comes from, is Spain. So, traditionally is where that comes from. But basically, what happens is countries start banning it, and I think Switzerland originally banned it. They banned the retail sale in 1907, and they outright banned it in 1910. So it took them a couple years, right? They knew they were going to have some response to it because it was such a big deal internationally. It doesn't look good on them because people believe the lies, et cetera. And nobody wants to be the country like, if they're basically saying that your country is the center of, what they were considering something like the crack epidemic of the time. No country wants that reputation. So they're going to have to make moves to ban it one way, shape, form, or the other. They know that everybody else is banning it or going to ban it. It never was a huge export to begin with. So it's not really going to hurt the country too awful bad to shut this thing down. Now, on a traditional level, obviously people are not going to be happy about this. And I'm sure even the people in the Swiss government weren't happy about this, but just the nature of the times and the way that things were, and, things rise and fall and they shift and they do the whole thing. The pendulum swings. But because of that, and because of those traditional values, it wasn't very hard to get away with making absinthe in the Swiss Alps at that time. You got to bear in mind that Swiss Alps is where it came from. Uh, uh, you have various varieties of wormwood that grow all over the Swiss Alps. That's their northernmost range. Varieties that I can't get a hold of, and a lot of people can't get a hold of, that actually grow in the Swiss Alps and that were part of the traditional 1700s. They're now coming back as the Swiss Blanche style. They still have, great trade relationships. They're not too awful far away from Spain. They can get a hold of Venice and the Mediterranean. They get a hold of their various phenols, etc. All those are still going to be available in the local apothecary. The local apothecary is your supply house for your illicit distillation, and absinthe still is going to maintain its health connotations amongst these people, because they know that all this stuff they've seen in the newspapers is all ridiculousness. They're smart enough.
Yeah.
Everybody should have been smart enough to look around and go, maybe we don't have an absinthe problem. Maybe we have an alcohol problem. Right. And
we've been drinking this stuff for like hundreds of years, and there hasn't been an outbreak of face eating.
Yeah.
So
that's a really good way to put it. Actually, yeah. I like that.
It's probably worth doing a little bit of a throwback to that first episode we did too, and in case people skipped that one, to kind of we've talked here about why they carried on doing it, right? It was traditionally important to them. But do you want to go back and give us just give us the kind of summary of why was it important? Why is it traditional? Like, what's the roots of absinthe, and why is it so interwoven into the culture?
So the roots of absinthe, it's a little different than gin or aquavit. And this is always worthwhile for people to look into it. All distilling has got alchemical roots. Most distilling has got medicinal roots to it. And the vast majority of the things that we know as botanical spirits either came out of monasteries or they came out of the Salerno school in Italy. Absinthe is a little different. So wormwood has got a usage in medicine and aromatized wine going back to at least the ancient Egyptians, if not the pre-dynastic Egyptians, going into wine as an anti-parasitic, etc. So it's been associated with alcohol for the vast majority of human civilized history to some degree, or at least recent human civilized history. Once you get into areas like the Val di Traverse, you got to remember that you're dealing with a time period after the Holy Roman Church comes along, sort of in the Dark Ages, across most of Europe. But then you have these little outposts, what Catholics might call the heath and the heather, right? These little places where civilization hasn't, quote unquote, hasn't quite reached these places, and so the ways are still alive and well. They're basically the European version of hillbillies. That's the best way to say it. Pagan hillbillies in Europe. That's really what they are. But everybody's, tante, that's an interesting word. Everybody's aunt is a green witch of some sort, or a granny witch, somebody who knows what herbs are growing in the mountains that can make you feel better. You got a stomach ache? We got a little bit of wormwood. We can get a hold of some anise through our trades. We're trading cheese and milk products for various things. I'd make you a tea, what they would call a tisane. That'll help settle your stomach. If that's not enough, we can, get some brandy that we've brought in from France, and we can macerate these botanicals in that and give you a little bit of a tincture. And that's really where the roots of absinthe start. And it's amongst specifically not just solitary practicing granny witches or green witches, but amongst what you might now think of as an actual coven, a society of green witches. The main one was the Henriods. People tend to think that the Henriods were sisters. They weren't sisters in that way. They were an actual sort of coven of green witches or granny witches in the Val di Traverse, in the Jura of the Val di Traverse. So there were them, but there were many others as well. And they were the ones that really pushed absinthe into becoming a thing, originally as a tincture, and then working through a doctor, whether willingly or unwillingly. We don't really know the whole story of that yet. The patent got handed over to this doctor who turned this into a commercial product. You got to remember the Swiss Alps at that time in the mid 1700s. That's sort of the last sort of liberal bastion that exists. It's free of the church. Women still have rights, etc., but it's coming to an end. And as it comes to an end, only men are going to be licensed to have anything to do with pharmacy. The other things happening that distillers should know, and I think this is lost in distilling history. So between the 1750s and up to about 1802, right, you had what were called liquorists. So you're an alchemist, you're a distiller. And so your job's not just making beverage alcohol. Your job is making perfumery, and your job is making medicine. And this is a time period where that's about to change, because the church doesn't like that. And kings don't like that. They like this nice little division of, nope, we're going to license pharmacists, and we're going to license perfumers, and we're going to license distillers, and no one should have all that information. So let's break it up. And so what you're seeing with absinthe in the 1700s is what is really a lost tradition of alchemy and green witchery coming together in a unique geographic region. And this is all integrated into the people in that region. Just as, same sort of culture in Germany in the Black Forest, but this culture of fairy tales and mythology and magic, but it all has things to teach you about real life and things that you pick up as generational knowledge, and that you pass down, you expand on, you write it down in your grammary, which is a Latin word for what we now know as a grimoire, or a book of magic, a book of giving you an idea of how to take care of yourself and take care of your people. And that's disappearing. That's where this comes from. But in these pockets, because they're so isolated, it's very quiet, very hush-hush. Don't say anything, right? Civilization moves in, but the granny witches don't go away. They just get much more quiet about what the hell they're doing, because you can only burn so many of them at the stake before they go, maybe we shouldn't talk out loud about this shit. Right?
Right.
So everybody's grandma.
Yeah. So everyone knows who to go to.
Right.
But we don't talk about it. We're just going over there for a cup of tea.
Or you go in. You go into weird categories like the Huguenots. I shouldn't say weird, but these sort of like on the fringes of Christianity, but there's still some paganism leaning there, or what they would call in England like cunning folk. So you're a Christian, but also you might use the Book of Psalms as something like a tarot deck, right? Or a spell book. Right. So you get into that weird little gray area there, which happened in most rural places. So certainly by the time you get to the ban, this is just an inherent thing that we do where we live. The Germans have got their brandies, and the English have got their gins, and the Dutch have their Genevieres, and the Americans have whatever the hell they're doing over there with that corn stuff. And this is what we have. We have absinthe. And this is, and other things related to it, Genipi and things of that nature. So
when the ban's looming, what does absinthe look like in that very local, like the birthplace of absinthe, right? Is absinthe still what it was 100 years ago, or is it kind of evolved due to outside influence? Where is it at right before the ban falls?
The closer to the border you get. Yeah, the closer to the border that you get, the more like what you have seen in France it gets, right? And that goes for coming from Paris north as well. So the further away from Paris you get, the more away from the Belle Epoque it gets, closer to what's happening in the Swiss Alps, right? So you have sort of a hybrid region there. Kind of in the same way that, between the lowlands and the highlands, it's not a perfect split.
Right.
You have your Glengoynes, right?
Yeah.
They exist for a reason. Now, the further away from civilization you get, the more primitive you're going to find things. And what I mean by primitive is, we talked about some of those different varieties of wormwood, for example. So, women going up into the hills and harvesting not just grand wormwood, but also various of the other subspecies of wormwood, bringing those back, drying them in barns. What's Grammy growing out there in her garden this year? Right. Maybe this is used for absinthe traditionally. Maybe it's not. So I think you'd have to look at it agriculturally too, because there probably were changes in the Swiss Alps in terms of now there's new seed varieties, those things more than currency, seed spreads, right? Because it's important. And so you probably saw some innovations there as well. I'm one of the things I do is I throw marigolds into absinthe a lot of times. It's also good for stomach ailments, etc. It's not traditionally used for absinthe, but why not? Why would you not use it? It fits right into the protocol for what you're using it for. So it also tastes good and smells good. So I suspect a lot of that was going on, but for the most part, pretty standard anise, fennel, wormwood. I will say though, in the Swiss Alps, they were much more open to using star anise, and I don't know why that is. I don't know if maybe it was just something that the pharmacies kept on hand potentially, and maybe we're running a little short on green anise. It's really expensive. It comes from Spain. Blah blah blah. Here's something that tastes similar to it. We can get it in bulk down at the apothecary, sort of thing. And they didn't seem to have any issue with that by the time the ban rolled around. Now, it was most of it that was being made at that time was still colored. They're in the Val d'Itravers region. But they have always had a tradition of having some uncolored absinthe too. It became much more common to do uncolored or Le Blue, reflective of the sky, or Blanche styles after the ban, because it wasn't illegal to distill. It was illegal to distill absinthe. So if the cop sees you walking down the road with a bottle and that bottle's green, he's obviously going to ask some questions. If that bottle's white, well, that could be brandy. Who knows?
That would be I have to imagine the biggest sort of obvious change in absinthe when the ban falls. And I have to imagine this is kind of a, from the law enforcement side, it's kind of like, hey guys, can you stop being dicks? If that's like a clear bottle, I know it's absinthe. You know that I know it's absinthe. Right. But I don't need to do anything.
Don't be an asshole. Exactly.
If it's clear, I can just kind of turn, like, I'm buying it off you as well. Don't make me arrest you for the shit that I'm buying from you.
Right.
So it's kind of like a cultural agreement. We've got to ban this, like you say. We got to make the country look like we're not absolute, heathens, I guess, is literally what it is, right? But at the same time, we all know that this is important to us culturally. It's embedded in our culture. We're not going to kill it off entirely. So the coloration, I can imagine, that's just obvious. Are there other changes to the spirit as well? And I'm really interested, if there are, to hear kind of what the pressure or the idea or why would anything else change? Can't you just make the same absinthe and not do the post-distillation digestion?
Yeah. So one of the things that changes, a couple things come to mind in particular. So one thing that does happen is the coloration botanicals now just become part of the distillation. You move them from the coloration post-distillation to being actually in there. A lot of times you're kicking the peppermint up. If you're using peppermint, that's going to go up a little bit in terms of what you're going to put into that distillation. A lot of times you're actually pulling the wormwood back just a little bit. And I think that is being done specifically because you're still going to get plenty of bitterness in that Belle Epoque style of about 100 grams per gallon, right? But now you no longer have the post-distillation things to sort of cover up some of that bitterness or modify it. So you need to pull it back just a hair a little bit. That being said, you're also not pushing the star anise and the green anise real hard in this stuff. If anything, you might even push the fennel just a little bit more than you ordinarily would. You're not going for sweet. You're going very much for something not totally dissimilar to what you did, Jesse. More of a set down, complex, let's take 10 minutes out of our day and talk as neighbors sort of thing, right? And certainly also still something that would be served alongside coffee, right? You're going to go into the cafe and you're probably going to eat a little something, then you have a cup of coffee and a cup of absinthe. The louche is still very popular, but in the Swiss Alps, the sugar thing was never really emphasized in any way, shape, or form. Rarely was absinthe ever served with sugar. Absinthe was served chilled quite often, specifically because you're in cold weather. So that's culturally, there's that. The other thing that does happen culturally that you might find interesting too is that much like in the Black Forest region in Germany, hiking was always a big deal. That ties into your mythology, your fairy tales, etc. It's a huge thing in the Swiss Alps too. And anywhere where there was a spring, you would have a box out in the open that a bottle of absinthe would be in, so that along your travels, you could stop and pour a glass of absinthe and use the spring water to proof it down with, dilute it down with.
How good is that, dude? So that's hilarious. My wife and eldest daughter literally took the day off school today to go to a dock hut. And so in New Zealand, DOC is the Department of Conservation. And we are super freaking lucky that one of their like quite high priorities is public walking trails and places to sleep, which I just grew up with. I thought that was normal. And then you go to other parts of the world and you're like, oh, is there a bush track here somewhere? And they're like, no. It's like, that's pristine rainforest and I can't go walking in it. As soon as you said that, I was imagining you've just walked for 7 hours with your 3 kids, like one of them's super keen and trying to get ahead. The other one's dragging their feet and won't go. Like you're soggy wet. You roll up at the hut and lo and behold, there's a bottle of absinthe sitting there for you.
Right. Just waiting for you. Yes. Yeah. Well, we have all those little library things. I don't know if you guys have those where people build boxes like the little free library thing. So they build boxes.
Oh, like the book.
Yeah.
Get a book, take a book.
You should just have like a little section in there with a bottle of absinthe, having a rough day to have one on us sort of thing. So yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, the wheels are turning there.
I could get in a lot of trouble for
it'll be in the shop next week.
Doing this. Yeah. Oh, hilarious. So you mentioned more peppermint. That is interesting to me. What do you think the idea there is? Why would they put more peppermint in it now? Is that just a change in taste? Is it to balance out, like you said, the fact that you don't have macerated herbs in the botanicals in the final product? Like, where do you think
that's
that
a lot
from?
of it? That's a lot of it, and also peppermint strides that line between sweet and savory, right? So it can go both directions, either direction. If you go back in the history of absinthe, peppermint was pretty common in the 1700s, but here again, you're upping it, and I think it's literally because of that lack of coloration. I think also, I'd have to do some more research on peppermint to say this for sure, but from my experience with using peppermint in various things, it is also a little bit of I call them flavor bridges. So those things that sort of, they complement one another, but they also sort of up themselves in a certain way. You very rarely, if you distill peppermint of its own accord, very rarely do you get peppermint if you don't have something there for a little bit of contrast, right? It just doesn't come off right as peppermint, but certainly adding it to something like anise, which is sweet, the same as adding some sugar to some peppermint when you boil it down, make oil out of it, etc. It's going to have an effect. So, now I will tell you this with the peppermint, it's a little bit weird because certain and where everything is grown obviously affects things, and what variety it is obviously affects things, and the amount being used affects things. Peppermint can go a little metallic from time to time, so that's just something to keep in mind if you're using it. So it can either be really good or it can be a little bit like putting a copper penny in your mouth. It can get real weird real quick. So
I have no idea why, but the first thing you said, the first thing that popped into my brain when you said that was I feel like drying the mint is going to help with that. And I don't know why. Why. Like, does that make any sense to you?
It does. It does. And most of these botanicals were dried, but I will tell you, it also was not uncommon. And if you do dry the mint, by the way, low temperatures, slow, always slow. So most of these botanicals, when they were drying them, they were going into these ventilated barns, but they were going up to the top floor where it would get as warm as it could, but they kept the sun off of them. So no light and as slow as you can, no real forced air, nothing of that nature. With wormwood, the other thing I should mention that I presume that this has always went on. I don't know for sure. I do know that definitely during this period, it became a little bit more common, at least with home producers, to also add fresh wormwood alongside dried wormwood. And usually it was in the form of like go out at the beginning of the year in the spring when the wormwood's first coming on and the shoots are just fresh on it. And you cut those shoots and use those. Now, how old that is, I don't know. But
with last year's dried wormwood?
Yep.
So you use the dried wormwood from last year and then the fresh spring shoots.
And then the fresh. Yep.
Okay.
And I don't know how much of that is. I don't have notes as far as like how many grams that is or anything. Like I've always been of the impression it's more like, this will give it a little a little something, just throwing a couple pieces in there just to push it sort of thing.
Yeah, right.
So,
we have the dried wormwood, but now there's wormwood on the bush.
Right.
We can have
might
more.
as well use it. Yeah. And when it grows
why
right
not?
next to your still outside, you might as well, So
Yeah, totally, dude. Interesting. Okay, so in terms of the overall stepping away from the production side of things and stepping towards the just drinking experience side of things, the first thing obviously is it isn't going to be green or green or brown in the glass. What, in terms of the aroma and the mouthfeel and the flavor, is going to be changing now that we're moving to the Le Blue?
Yep. So interestingly enough, you have two things. So while it is a little more savory than the Belle Epoque because the wormwood is much more present, even though it's a lower amount of wormwood, there's also a perceived sweetness or candy-like characteristic to it because star anise has become fairly common to use in absinthe at this point, right? So it's really a matter of getting that balance right. But you might see, actually, and I have seen notes where there were producers that were just using star anise at that time as opposed to any green anise. I suspect that was probably frowned upon for the most part, but it definitely did happen.
Hey, if that's what you've got.
Right, exactly. The other thing that happens is you have to rely on your botanicals for all the mouthfeel. So licorice root is definitely going to be a part of this distillation, and it's not going to be like a licorice paste or anything like that, like they were doing in the Belle Epoque. It is going in the distillation for mouthfeel alongside often angelica root and angelica seed again. And the reason for that is because they are no longer using brandy for the most part to distill the spirit. We're full on in the industrial age. They're not trying to get in trouble for tax evasion, which is what they'd be doing if they were making their own base alcohols. And if the goal is to have a blank palette and on which to paint, or blank canvas on which to paint your painting, the pharmacy down the road is selling high proof sugar beet alcohol that's neutral. That's what we're going to go buy. We're going to pay our taxes on it so nobody can ever say that we're defrauding our government of taxes. Then we're going to bring that back. We're not going to do anything to it other than modify it with botanicals. And voila, really, if we're not selling it, quote unquote, we've not broken any laws, truthfully. So
yeah, right. So this is just another part of that kind of unspoken handshake between, hey, it's illegal. But no one's going to come knocking on your door, even though we know.
It's very much the pharmacist certainly would have known it, much like the awkwardness of a teenage boy going in and pretending not like he's not looking at condoms. The pharmacist knows. Oh, he knows. He's watching.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And he knows that it may be slightly shady, but at the same time, it's the best thing to do in this certain situation is just give the man some condoms.
Yeah. And exactly, and they're going to make good quality spirit too. Because here's the other thing I can consistently say about the Swiss Alps and the absinthe that came from the Swiss Alps, it still exists to this day. There's actually a brand called Le Clandestine, which is phenomenal for what it is. It's a little lower proof than I would have liked. And a lot of times they were bottling them at closer to 120, 110, even some as low as 108 at that time. That wasn't uncommon. But again, this is something that you're also going to loosh down with water, but you're also drinking this during your work day, right? This is just get you out of your...
Right.
Yeah, it's like a cigarette sort of thing, basically. But there are several Swiss absinthes that descend from this style that still exist to this day, without a doubt. And they're very representative of what was happening. In fact, many of them were able to get their license despite the fact that the law knew that they had been, skirting the law at the least because they had kept the receipts for buying the alcohol over the years. And that's a true story. That's something that you can verify and look up. A lot of them, when they applied for their permits, they also submitted receipts for all the alcohol for all the quote unquote illicit absinthe distilling they had done way back when. So certainly covered their bases. I'm not sure that would fly in the United States, but it certainly flew over there because, again, everybody knew this was part of what we do. So,
yeah, that's awesome. So you mentioned a couple of times the idea of the wormwood's more present, even though there's less wormwood. And is that just? I think I kind of missed what you were saying, but I think you were saying it's just because you're not covering it up with actual sweetness and actual mouth flavor from. Everything's distilled. There's no
there's that
maceration. Okay.
The other part of it is you're pulling your anise back. So in the Belle Epoque, where you're looking at like 200, 250 grams per gallon, now you're looking maybe something like 150 grams per gallon, right? And part of that might be star anise. So although the wormwood has been pulled back, everything else has been sort of balanced a little bit more, right? You're after complexity, but you're not after decadence, essentially. So
yes, okay, that makes that is a great descriptor. I think that puts it very much in my head what it is, which is similar to what I was going for, right? Like I wanted the sweetness, I wanted the mouthfeel, but I didn't want it to finish sickly sweet.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted it to be moreish. I wanted it to,
on an average everyday basis, I've always preferred that Swiss style. If there was an everyday drinker of absinthe, that's the style that's going to be the everyday drinker of absinthe. I think for most people, truthfully, and it not anything that doesn't have to be spruced up. Sometimes old granddad just needs to be old granddad. So,
right, yeah, yeah, I feel you. Hilarious. All right, man. So let's kind of shift before we shift the conversation to sort of how would we go about recreating this in modern times with the equipment we have and what we have available. Is there any other sort of part of the story that I'm missing that you think is culturally or historically significant to the spirit?
Yeah. So,
good. I'm glad I asked.
The other thing to bear in mind is this was also for the time very, very important. So, what are we leading up to when by the time you get to 1910 they put a ban on absinthe? We're about to all end up in a world war, right? Things are about to get real scary.
Oh, wow!
The first real modern warfare is about to go down on a scale that none of us have ever seen before, right? And this is just like it has been for Napoleon's men in the past. This is a way of coping,
and we're talking about the Swiss. I hadn't put that together. Yeah, right. Yeah, here we go. Right. Okay,
exactly. So there's a Greek word, theriac. So theriac is like imagine it as like an antidote or an antivenom, but it doesn't mean the same thing. It means the thing that takes the bad part away, right? That's what the word theriac means. And this is their theriac is what this is. The other thing that this is doing for cultures throughout the world, and even here in the United States in particular, is that, so for example, some of our great writers like Hemingway went out of his way to get a hold of illicit Swiss style absinthe because he knew that it was high quality. Now, I don't know how much Hemingway gave a shit because he was also drinking really bad Cuban absinthe at the time, but he certainly went out of his way a few times to go find Swiss style absinthe. And I'm sure that he wrote more than a few words while he was drinking Swiss style absinthe. He was also buying some Spanish absinthe at the time. But this is the tradition that keeps the lights on for almost everybody. I can't imagine. Maybe there was one weird dude in New Orleans somewhere that was distilling absinthe legally, but I can't imagine in the U.S. there was a whole lot of people just, biting at the bit to distill some illicit absinthe. I mean, even the big companies, Herb Saint went from absinthe to Herb Saint. So no longer the same sort of thing.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So like if it wasn't for the Swiss Alps, the world would have lost absinthe.
I very much so. True absinthe, I very much so believe that is the case. I certainly do, because I think it definitely disappeared in France. It really had. It had been replaced by pastis completely. And it seems like such an easy thing. Well, pastis is just absinthe without wormwood. No, not exactly. And a pastis producer might have thought, well, all I got to do is
that's like saying it's gin but without juniper. It's that's what makes it.
I think even the evidence of it is if you look at the producers who moved from France to Spain, by the time you get to the 1980s, those absinthes that are coming out of Spain have a terrible, terrible reputation. And it's because they've forgotten how to do these things, and they don't have anybody to rely on to tell them how to do them anymore. So not only in the Swiss Alps do you have this long tradition, but you have the tradition of what some might term the right way of doing it, right? Like you got a few hundred years worth of doing this. So somebody still exists that can verify how at least that style is made, and it's still of quality as opposed to, maybe you end up in Cuba and you're doing something out of rum, and maybe not even rum, maybe even something like cachaça or whatever. It's not necessarily the greatest base in the world for making absinthe. Or you end up in South America and you're using pisco, and then South America goes through turmoil, and the pisco you're getting is no longer what it once was, and who knows what it's made out of, etc. So certainly these guys, I always joke that MGP was, they kept the lights on for Indiana. So these guys were keeping the lights on for absinthe producers in many, many ways. And I don't think a lot of the rest of the world was, you don't hear stories about Appalachian moonshiners making absinthe. So
Right.
it's not a.
So this comes full circle back to what you said at the very beginning in terms of this is the style of absinthe, and the point in history that saved absinthe, because absinthe had been bastardized, and then a bastardization of a bastardization, and then some schmuck who just wanted to make a quick buck on a bastardization of a bastardization, and the ban trimmed all of that. We lost all of it, and we went back to the source of absinthe, like the thing that made absinthe to the people that gave a shit about absinthe, the people that were making absinthe because they cared, not because they were trying to get rich.
And not because it was trendy. Exactly. Yeah. It also, there's a lesson here for home distillers too. And it goes back to what we said at the very beginning, the difference between method and approach, right? I'm not so sure that most of the absinthe distillers in the Swiss Alps at that time would have said that it had that much to do with the distilling method, because they're all using very basic apparatus. But certainly the changes that get made have everything to do with approach, and what do you have on hand, and why are you doing what you're doing, and does it still pay tribute to what came before, right? And so that's what I feel like was most important to them. The other side of that is that, just like with the Belle Epoque, you will see that there were some producers that kept it as basic as they could. And what I mean by that is literally wormwood, anise, and hyssop, and that's it, nothing else. Right. Not in as heavy a quantities as what they were doing in the Belle Epoque, but certainly very basic, but those aren't nearly as much fun as let's cram whatever weird thing Grams has got growing in her garden. Let's put that in here. And that's also
under that same idea of what is the point in absinthe, right? Like, culturally, why are we doing this? And not in terms of flavor, but in terms of flavor experience, why are we doing this? It should be slightly bitter. It should be have that kind of numbing, slick, oily presence in the mouth. It should be balanced. It should probably potentially louche. It should be, it should be heavy enough on botanicals to louche if we louche it.
And the louche
we fit within that framework, and then we use anything we can find.
I'm glad you mentioned the louche too, because that's something I didn't mention. They don't tend to louche as heavy, and it's not considered as important as it was in Belle Epoque. Like, these are not like real heavy opalescent louches. They'll go opalescent to some degree, but they're not like, it's not like looking at a glass of prismatic milk, right? It doesn't have to be that heavy here. Your louche is not far off of what a lot of the Swiss Alps are. And there is another weird thing that I should mention here, and I've had good versions of this and bad versions. There's also a little bit of a tradition of slipping back into the tincturing here, to where some of the botanicals are, this is a little bit more modern, but it's still interesting. Some of the botanicals are macerated and distilled. Some are then added post-distillation. Now, this wouldn't have been at that time period, it'd been a little later on, but by the time you get to the 60s and 70s and you start seeing people getting back into like spagyric medicine and that sort of stuff, you will see this in the Swiss Alps, like adding like those shoots of wormwood to the actual distilled absinthe as well. Not only just for color, but for the flavor. Now, those can get real medicinal real quick. But I think they had the levity to do that because they weren't as worried about the louche, right? It's a little bit more about, this is a medicine sort of thing, et cetera. Everything just goes around in circles. You know how it is. So,
technical question for you. I was really surprised when I louched this down at the beginning of this podcast. I sent you a photo, what was that, like maybe 6 weeks ago, of when I'd first made this. Yep. And it's the heaviest louche I've ever had. Like I proofed it down only to 35%, and you couldn't see through it.
Right.
Now that it's sat for 6 weeks, it is lushing, but not nearly as heavily. What's the deal with that? And I was using ice water too. I had ice water here.
Yeah.
Is that just that everything that's in solution, like there's no longer any of that stuff that's in suspension? It's actually all dissolved because it sat there for so long? Or
it's a really good question, but one thing I didn't ask you. So, did you use any licorice root in that?
No licorice root. No.
Okay. So,
in fact, there was no root at all.
Yep. So anethol will loosh, but it won't make a real heavy loosh. So during the Belle Epoque, a lot of times they didn't even actually distill the licorice root in with the absinthe. They would make like a paste. They had a name for it. I can't remember what it is, but they would mix that in with it. But that's what holds that loosh in suspension because there's so much oil there in the licorice root. That's a big part of holding that traditional Belle Epoque style loosh and making it super heavy, when I did that black absinthe, once it started to fade a little bit, it looked like Yoo-hoo once you looshed it down. I mean, it looked like chocolate milk. It was just thick. So, pretty common to use that as sort of a fixative as far as your looshing goes. So now let me rephrase that. So here's a question for people who are listening, and maybe somebody can answer this. So typically, once you loosh an absinthe, the science is that the way that saponification process works, it should stay looshed for months, right? You should be able to set it out in a glass, cover it up, and let it set, and it stay looshed for months. We just did an absinthe that is the heaviest botanical load absinthe I have ever done at Old Homestead, and it looshes very much like a glass of milk. I mean, it is a dark, dark loosh. If you set it outside for about an hour, it will drop the loosh. And I still have not figured that one out. So I don't, if anybody out there, Ted Bro probably listen to this and be like, oh yeah, well, see, this idiot beat me in a competition, but he doesn't know that much.
Strip him of his awards.
That's right. Send me his trophies now.
Yeah. The only guess I would have is that a large part of it's not actually truly saponification. It's literally just you've got so much stuff in solution. Uh-huh. You lower the alcohol content, which is the thing that it's dissolved in.
Yeah,
and it can no longer hold. It's basically precipitating in the glass,
right?
And the act of dropping the water in is quite a shock to it. Mm-hmm. If you let it sit for a while, it'll slowly dissolve back in. I guess it's more like boiling off water in cane juice to make sugar. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's not changing the chemical makeup of anything. It's just crystallizing it. It's dropping it out of solution. That would be my only guess, dude.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just the only one I've ever seen do it. I've never seen one do that before until then. So, but yeah.
I mean, I get it with quite often when I make gin, when I proof it down, it goes cloudy. Yeah. And then you let it sit in the bottle. And if it's right on that edge of, oh shit, did I proof this a little bit too low for what this can handle? You let it sit for 2 weeks and crystal clear again. Nice. Crazy. All right, man. So, how do we go about reproducing this? How do we go about being able to experience this style of absinthe for ourselves?
Yep. So I think starting off with somewhere between, let's call it somewhere between 80 and 100 grams of wormwood is a good point.
Oh, and what size batch are we? Per gallon. Okay. Yeah.
Yep. Per gallon. Yep. Let's
say it is quite a lot less.
Yes. Yeah. So, versus 120, et cetera, and up for some of those. I mean, some of those Belle Epoques were insane, the amount that they were putting into those. But so 100 between 80 and 100 grams per gallon of wormwood. Let's say somewhere around 150 grams of anise and fennel, both separately, right? You might even push the fennel a little bit over the anise because you want some of that savory sort of thing. The star anise could either be its own separate component, maybe at 30 or 40 grams per gallon is a pretty hefty dose of star anise, or you can switch out some of the green anise for the star anise, or if you want to, now again we're dealing with bootlegging, so you can kind of world's your oyster. You can switch out all the green anise for star anise if you wanted to. So depending on what you like. Certainly, you're going to want licorice root in there. It doesn't have to be a whole lot, but just kind of as a binder again, because you're going to be should be using something like a base alcohol that's real close to neutral. As close to 190 as you can get. Obviously, you can't go to the pharmacy and buy 190 nowadays. So, whatever your equipment will bear, that's what you're going to want to do to get as close to the style as what you can. That licorice root is going to be there as much for mouthfeel as it is for anything. So let's say 3 grams per gallon of licorice root. Pretty decent. Maybe even like 2 grams.
Real low.
Yep. Hyssop, you're going to be in maybe that 10 to 15 grams per gallon. Lemon balm, 10 to 15 grams per gallon. You could push that a little harder if you want to, maybe up to 30 grams per gallon. Coriander, probably in the 10 to 20 grams per gallon sort of range. And this doesn't all have to be in one recipe. I'm throwing these out there as options that people can move in, move out, etc. Because again, this is less structured than the other stuff.
Upper and lower.
Right.
Upper and lower sort of levels for any one ingredient.
And it doesn't have to be all these botanicals either. It can be, mix and match as long as it's an absinthe, right?
Yep.
So
just to clarify, I think what you're saying for people listening to this is you wouldn't go through and pick the upper limit for every one of these botanicals in one recipe.
Right.
You'd be super heavy on botanical load if you did that.
Yep. Or if I was somebody that didn't like coriander wasn't in every Swiss Blanche, right? It's much less,
right.
You can kind of substitute out for some other things. Angelica root and seed, very common in the Swiss Alps. So anywhere between, with the root, maybe 2 grams per gallon, with the seed up to 10 grams per gallon which is a lot. Like you wouldn't ever really go that heavy. You're again closer to 2. Again, depending on what you're after. The spearmint or the peppermint. So 10 to 20 grams per gallon on peppermint. You can go there. A lot of these secondary characters, as long as that wormwood, the anise, and the fennel are at the forefront, and the hyssop, these secondary things, you can anywhere between, typically, as long as they're not roots, between 10 and 20 is a pretty good starting point on a lot of those sort of things. So you don't need a whole lot of those here. Trying to think of some other things that were fairly common at that time to throw in. We mentioned lemon balm. We mentioned peppermint. We mentioned angelica root and seed, peppermint, or licorice root, anise, fennel, wormwood.
Citrus?
Lemon occasionally was there. Okay. Chamomile. That's the other thing. Chamomile. So this is one fancy thing that they would often do. You can macerate chamomile if you want to, but it tends to come off as wet sock, as dirty sock. It's not particularly good.
Okay. Loses the floral sort of.
Yep. It's good in a vapor path, but you have to be very mindful of it and how much of it that you're using. If you do put this in a vapor path, you want that vapor path to be one that you can turn on and off. So, because what will happen
like a
is
Carter head style.
Yep, where you can bypass whatever you need to do,
or just bypass.
Yep. Because you will blow all the volatiles off that chamomile very, very quickly. So you're going to want to bypass your heads, and then as soon as you cut to your hearts, let it run just a few, drops to get some of the oils out of there and get some of that funkiness out of there. Then open that gin basket and infuse your chamomile. I'm hesitant to say how much chamomile, because I've never seen it written down as any sort of amount. It's more of a use your discretion sort of thing. So I don't want to mess that up for somebody. So we did chamomile in our Le Blue at Spirits of French Lick, and I can't remember roughly where that was at. It was a decent amount of chamomile, but the basket was on for maybe 15 minutes. I mean, it was, it was quick. And that was on a 350 gallon still. So, 15 minutes is fast. So just bear that in mind. I guess
if you're doing it like that, in some ways you could do it so it doesn't matter, right? You could put a metric buttload of chamomile in there, run it for 15 minutes, and then tincture that with your final product. And maybe say, if you end up with way too much, you save it for the next 3 batches of absinthe.
And when you do the chamomile, by the way, the other thing I should warn everybody of, if you do the chamomile or anything in a vapor basket with absinthe, because the oils are so heavily laden in that absinthe, when you hit that vapor basket, don't freak out if you look at the liquor in bulk and see a little bit of a yellow tinge to it. It's not puking.
Okay.
It's not doing anything weird. It's just pulling a little bit of that color across. You might be running a little bit too fast, but it's pretty common. And if you pull a glass out and look at it, you'll never see that tinge. It'll never show up. Same thing as with the Belle Epoque as well. When you're distilling this stuff, you're going to have two different Tels fractions. You're going to have a high Tels fraction, which you'll set aside for your next distillation, or for redistillation potentially if you want to, or your next distillation. And then definitely, if you don't keep that high Tels, keep the low Tels, the blanquette. That's where all the oils are. The worm will get to where it can't hold those oils in suspension, or your condenser will, and it'll go milky. Every bit of that needs to go into your next run. All of it does. All of the milky stuff.
So to clarify, you make your heads cut, you take your hearts, which is this. That's what's going in the bottles for this run.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got your high tails, which is basically you want to reclaim alcohol out of that, so it goes into your next reflux run when you're making the next vodka or whatever it is. Your vodka might taste slightly absinthe, but who gives a shit when you're making vodka to make absinthe anyway? And then the low tails is that's more in line with the kind of rum tradition, or even some bourbon sort of moonshiny type stuff, where we're putting that back into the next run for carryover flavor. You keep building it up, and eventually that flavor starts spewing over into the heart's cut rather than tails again.
Awesome. Your maceration, I should say this too. So even though you're using 190 proof ethanol, you're going to proof that down to 170, just like you have previously. You're still going to macerate at 140 degrees, just like you have previously, for about 1 hour or however long, just to be able to hold it at 140 for a while. Maceration, if you're putting botanicals in the still, 24 hours is good. If you're not able to put botanicals in the still, you're going to want to let that set for a week or so before you redistill it. And then if I were making my own alcohol at home as the base for this, I think what I'd probably do is just do a sugar wash. But what I would do is very specifically go out of my way not to buy cane sugar. So here in the US, and I don't know if it's the same over there, Jesse, it's real hard to find just like stuff that's labeled as beet sugar. But if you go to Walmart or somewhere like that, they'll usually have like the cane sugar has its own little section. And then there's what they have that they call table sugar, which is mostly just straight up beet sugar. So usually in a blue bag here in the US, but that's what I would use as my base for that, would be that table sugar, because it's mostly beet sugar. It's going to give you the same effect if you can get it to 190 as what you'd get from distilling sugar beets, essentially.
Yeah, interesting. I went looking for beet sugar for the last episode. Couldn't find any. But I think I did have a few comments saying, "Oh, actually, you can get it. You need to look for this." So I'll go back and have a look through those and see if I can figure it out. I think from memory, I ended up using cane sugar and then putting roast beetroot into it. Actually,
I think it wasn't terrible, dude.
It tasted kind of good. Added a little bit of earthiness to it.
It was in the US before the whole COVID thing happened. It was fairly easy to find beet sugar. And then I don't know, I guess during COVID, if it just made more sense to put it in the table sugar and let's just do away with this extra thing that we have because supplies are what they are, right? Let's get it out there. But I know if you're in the US, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think this is where you can get it from. If you're looking for pure beet sugar, I'm almost positive that Rule King is about the only place that carries it. And it's like Pioneer Woman brand or something like that. It comes in a pink package, and you will pay a premium for it. For a sugar that otherwise most of the time is not as good to use for distillation, is what I would say, at least in my experience. So bear that in mind. You will pay for the displeasure.
If I have to imagine that we're distilling this to 190 and then we're smacking it with a metric buttload of botanicals and then we're distilling it again, cane sugar is not going to be the end of the world, right? Like,
oh yeah, it's not going to hurt anything. You're going for neutral, basically, is all you're after. So those medical grade alcohols, even at that time, they had long since mastered the fractionating columns and all that stuff. So they're not much flavor left. In fact, I would even argue probably that if you stayed a little rougher than what you normally would, maybe run your still a little bit faster, you're redistilling it anyways. I don't think you need to be, you don't have to be incredibly masterful of making that neutral spirit, because what they were buying from the apothecaries was it was considered medical grade ethanol. So they're not worried about how it tastes in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, right. I'm with you.
So
yeah, cool. Awesome, dude. Is there anything different on the distillation side? I mean, in terms of the kinds of stills they were using at that point, had they changed? In terms of making cuts, is there anything different based on the recipe?
So same as any time that you're redistilling something that's high proof, make sure you're 80 proof or under when you redistill, right? The other part of it is, as far as stills go, kind of sky's the limit there. Like I would tend to say that the vast majority of these people are using traditional alembic stills, and maybe much more basic.
The same still sitting on the farm, the same
Exactly.
still on the same farm from 300 years ago kind of thing. Or 200 years ago, I guess, at that point.
The other part of it is, I think you could get away with some fancy bells and whistles if you wanted to, like say the gin basket or whatever, because the other thing that's happened at this point is all those absinthe distilleries have gone out of business. There's a whole bunch of equipment all of a sudden on the market.
Interesting.
So, and depending on how big your business was, and certainly if you're running a farm that was supplying wormwood to France during the Belle Epoque, you've got some stuff to work with. You might want a little something nicer to kick things along,
to totally not sell alcohol.
Right. And I do suspect too, there probably were some of those guys that were bigger players that were potentially bringing in some brandy from France as a base, or maybe even mixing that brandy as well with, their beet sugar stuff. This one's as close to a modern absinthe as you can get without going fully modern, right? Without, Americanizing it or whatever you're going to do with it. This is a little more, you got a little more leeway to play with this one. So.
Yeah, cool. Well, that's a good point, actually, Alan. I think we've pretty much covered everything we need to cover in terms of Le Blue, but in terms of the story of absinthe, a little teaser for what we could do in the next podcast in this series. Is there another historic absinthe to touch on, or are we now into? Is this pretty much modern absinthe that we're going to be talking about next?
I think modern absinthe is next. I think the only thing that falls in between is the re-legalization, which we've touched on many times. And then Ted Bro, give him all due credit for everything he did. Plus a group of home distillers that worked alongside him, or were passionate about the same things that he was at that time. I wish I had a name for those guys, but I don't know that they ever were organized enough to have a name at that time. But
they may not want a name put to it either.
Yeah, some of them are still out there for sure. Just as weird as you could ever imagine they would be. I would say that, but so if Ted's thing is, let's do gas chromatography, let's figure out what was going on in the Belle Epoque, what was happening in these varieties, let's reproduce them, let's have a liquor line that's based on that, let's do an Americanized version with lesser wormwood, etc. What's after that? Right. And a whole bunch of bad absinthes came out 2007 through 2012, 13, 14, etc. We're in the period now where we can make this into an actual thing. People are a little bit more adventurous about drinking. How do we do that? Still pay tribute to what happened before, but have the right approach again, right? Approach and method, because we have to understand the basics. But what is the approach of modern absinthe? What should the approach be? And I don't think, I will say this. I don't think it should be ever considered anywhere near as wide as something like gin or aquavit. I think that there's, because this comes from a tincturing tradition and the use of the botanicals is so catered towards the medicinal side of things, I think there are certain parameters you have to stay within. But there's still all kinds of botanicals out there and all kinds of colorants out there that fall into that same sort of family. And uniquely American ingredients, uniquely New Zealand ingredients, Australia, etc. Things that you can do to put your own spin on it, just as creative as anything that happens in the gin and aquavit space. But I don't think it's so much like, do we really want an absinthe producer that's only putting 2 grams of wormwood per gallon? Because that's what you'll get if you treat it like gin. Yeah. And I don't think that then it's absinthe. So.
Yeah, no, I feel you. And I mean, there's even that within the gin world, right? Like, 50% of the botanicals should be juniper. Well, it ain't. On a lot of things that are labeled gin, right? That's just simply not true.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying, dude. Like the thing that jumped to mind for me is we have a plant called kawa in New Zealand. It's a big heart-shaped leaf. It tastes kind of peppery, kind of sappy, I guess would be the word, with a really interesting herbal quality to it. And that traditionally was used for a lot of medicines by the Māori in New Zealand. It has a really cool green color to it when you macerate it. So no one in the Swiss Alps would have ever used kawa. But if instead of trying to make Swiss absinthe, we take the approach of Swiss absinthe, I've got a bush growing in my backyard, right?
That's
and
perfect.
It has a connotations to health and medicine. It's
That's
traditional to the land here. It grows everywhere. That makes sense. Yeah.
1,000,000%. Yeah. I mean,
so I hear what you're saying, man.
Same thing.
You mentioned a long time ago too, dude. You mentioned to me, probably in the first episode we did on this, was that pretty much anywhere you go in the world, you're going to find a plant that isn't grand wormwood, but it's going to taste similar, it's going to grow similar, and it's probably going to have alpha-thujone in it.
Probably be relative. Absolutely.
Yeah. And ever since you said that to me, the idea of finding like is there something like that in New Zealand? And B, what is it? And C, how does it taste when you distill it?
I bet it's everywhere too. Once you find out what it is,
grows like a weed. Yeah.
I do know that in Australia, I had a person reach out to me through One Piece at a Time one time. There's actually a type of wormwood that's a tree, and it grows in Australia.
Oh.
And they were asking about using that. And I said, I'd do some research on it and see what the medical use of it is and what dosages and all that stuff. But if it's considered safe for human consumption, then yeah, I don't know why you wouldn't, So
I mean, the worst that can happen is you try it and it tastes like ass, right?
Right, exactly. Well, and to your point too on the approach thing, I would say something here that I think people find interesting. Alcohol brings people together, right? And we spend a lot of time sort of dividing people under categories, and people get along with people you don't, reasons you like them, reasons you don't, etc. But is there really, short of geographically, that much of a difference between what you might call a granny witch in the Swiss Alps and what you might consider a shaman in Oaxaca, for example, or maybe, someone in South America, or someone using marigolds, which do the same thing? Like if they'd had access to marigolds in the Swiss Alps, they'd have probably used marigolds. Some idiot like me would have been like, you know what? I want a yellow absinthe. Why wouldn't I want a yellow or an orange absinthe?
Totally, dude. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's I completely agree. Totally agree. All right, dude, this has been an absolute blast, man. It always is.
Same.
I can't wait to get stuck in and give this a nudge. For people that have listened all the way through, hey, we appreciate you. Thanks for that. The plan on all of these is to do the podcast. A, because they're really freaking interesting, and B, because I get to pick Alan's brain and get all the juicy details on then how to go and make a video that of me making this absinthe. So I'm really looking forward to trying that. Unfortunately, I skipped the whole sending you the 1800s absinthe thing, dude.
Right.
I planned on it, and then I blinked, and I drank it all. That was fun.
Well, that happens. I've been guilty of that before too, and I will tell you, I'm looking forward to when you get over here, because I have something at Old Homestead that I'll be honest with you. I'll tell you this might excite you. So most distillers, they come out with a product and people do an interview with them or whatever, and they'll be like, well, what inspired you to do this? And they always have some big, deep philosophical, answer to the question, right? Because you got to look good in front of the public. So I might have really messed up an absinthe recipe in terms of the amount of botanicals and that sort of stuff, and then had to redistill it and try to fix it and messed it up again. And then on the third try, I was like, you know what? Does this really have to be the thing you set out for it to be? You've got, 8 gallons of it. It's not a whole lot, whatever. what if we just went ahead and pushed this as hard as we could? And so what I have is what I call a big boy absinthe. So this thing is, it is everything the Belle Epoque was, but with a bunch of that bitter, like heavy characteristic to it. Like, you're not going to sit down and drink a lot of this, but you're going to have a glass of it and you're going to spend 30 minutes with that glass going, what is that? What is happening here? Right. And in the best of possible ways. Like, I'm going to release it. We're going to call it Lion is what it's going to be called. It's going to be colored with marigolds. It's never going to be made again because I couldn't make it again if I wanted to. So, but it is its own little weirdness that it'll exist. That's what I'll say. It'll be a thing. So,
yeah, dude, that sounds amazing. I've how do you put it? Yes, if everyone was perfect, you wouldn't make mistakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if no one ever made mistakes, nothing new would ever get made. Like,
you're absolutely right.
Do you think the first person that put like wine or alcohol into an oak barrel were like, oh, we're going to do this because it's delicious? No, they did it for, I'm sure they did it for logistics reasons, and it was an accident.
Right.
And then one of those barrels got forgotten and sat there for longer, and someone was like, you know what? I'm kind of into this.
Well,
like
a friend asked me
I don't
on
know, man. I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Was I sorry?
I was going to say
I was just going to say, carry on. I've only had 1.5 glasses of absinthe.
Right. I'm telling you what, man, it's that caffeine, dude. I'm ready. A friend asked me on a podcast the other day, we were talking about Old Homestead, and I was telling him about this smoked oat inspired by poachine thing that I'm doing, right? But it's a sugar shine, and that's
cool.
Nothing wrong with that in my opinion. But I'm putting it in number 3 charred oak barrels, and I'm pretty well known for doing number 2 char on like all my bourbons, rye, etc. And he goes, what was the purpose of, or what was the idea behind going number 3 char? Because you always do number 2 char. And, I thought about it for a second. I was like, okay, I could give a bullshit distiller's answer.
Can I have a guess?
Yeah, feel free.
Can I have a guess?
Yeah.
Someone fucked up the order.
No, but real close.
Bought the wrong barrels by mistake.
Real close. Nope, they bought them before I came there, so they're sitting there. I can't let them go to waste. I have to use them. They're not my preferred barrel, but why not? Let's do this. It's smoked. It'll hold up. So
that's awesome, dude. Awesome. Yeah. We need to figure out getting together in person sometime, man. And about 3 weeks ago, I had a podcast with JJ Jackson as well. So I need to figure out how to go and hang with him because he seems like a cool dude as well.
He is great distiller. Great distiller. And
man,
to his
cool
credit
ideas.
To his credit too, the guy that he works for, Christian, is a fantastic, phenomenal distiller. And I will tell you, I can't imagine that he hired JJ lightly because Christian's a lot like I am. Like he loves this. Like the fact that he would come off the position of distilling himself to let anybody else distill says a lot about JJ.
Yeah.
So
yeah, dude. Yeah. No, I was impressed by him instantly for a lot of reasons. Like technical knowledge, sure. The like you say, the kind of the intent behind what he's doing and the reasons he's doing what he's doing. I don't know if impressed is the right, like it intrigued me.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, I feel like we could do another 3 podcasts and talk about any one of those things you just brought up, and I'd have a great time.
Yep. Well, he's also another quick aside about him, but he, being on the show Moonshiners, but he's a great example of what should be on shows like that in terms of
yes,
he's there as the representation of an urban home distiller. You know what I mean?
Yep.
We're not just, there's not a whole lot of guys running around the woods making moonshine. It just ain't happening. It's not a thing that does happen that much anymore. But the real people that are really into this are people like JJ who live in town and they do this in their apartment or their home or whatever. And so he's a great representation of the home distilling culture that we're representing in a major TV show. So
yeah, totally. Well, and that part of it impressed me in two ways. One is that I'm putting words in his mouth a little bit, but the impression I got that he basically said, yeah, I'd be happy to be involved in this. But if I'm going to be involved in this, I'm going to be me.
Yep.
I'm not here for the drama. I'm not here to fight with people. I'm not here to like talk about how much money I'm going to make on this run and how I'm going to run away from I'm here to make some good shit. And if you don't want that, like, I don't want to be here. Pretty cool on his point. Because, like, let's face it, it is for someone like him that was wanting to get into the industry, it's a pretty big opportunity to.
It's a great stepping stone.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll do whatever you need me to do. Just put me on that camera.
Yep.
But two, I was, how do I put it? I was pleasantly surprised that it seems like the producers agreed to his conditions and let him be that person on the show. And not only that, they're inviting him back to be that person more. Yep. And it's kind of nice to see a little bit more of that art meets science side of things creeping into the show and sort of actually representing what distilling is to me, not basically, the secret life of housewives, but with beards and beer bellies,
Right.
So I found that kind of cool too. Right.
Well, shout out to nice. As well, him and Amanda both. So one of the things is a history lover in the United States of distilling history, both represent in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania does not get nearly the love that it should in the distilling world. So that's awesome.
Well, I mean, he told me the history of rock and rye. And that got me pretty excited to give that a nudge as well. And I mean, I'd never heard of rock and rye. I mean, I think maybe I kind of knew the name, but I had no idea what it was. So I'm waiting for, funny story, dude, horehound. Can't get horehound in New Zealand.
Really?
It has been. You remember I told you about DOC, the Department of Conservation? It's been recognized as a noxious weed by DOC in New Zealand, and they are making efforts to eradicate it in New Zealand. Seems like not a single person has found the benefit of horehound as a herb. You can't get it. So I looked up a bunch of photos and went looking, couldn't find it. And then I was like, you know what? I don't trust my botanical skills enough to not kill myself by picking the wrong thing. So
well played.
I'll just order some from America and wait the 3 weeks.
If you can get the old fashioned horehound candy, you can buy that on Amazon. And all that is horehound tea that's been sweetened with sugar. So it's perfect. And you can buy it for cheap. And it's also really good if you make like a stone beer for distilling. Throw some of that in there instead of sugar. It's fantastic. So
when you say a stone beer, you mean like with heated rocks?
Yep. Like a Groot sort of thing. Yeah, we do that quite a bit for demonstrations, and I almost always throw horehound in there. I don't care if it's historic or not. I just grab horehound candy, and I'm like, you know what? I'll replace some sugar with some horehound candy. So.
That's awesome, dude. All right, man. Thanks a bunch, Alan. I really appreciate it, dude. I appreciate everything you do, man. And I don't know how it's going to play out, but a little peek behind the curtain, depending on when this gets released, we are. I'm working with Into the Aim on a new shirt that's absinthe themed because absinthe's I've gotten obsessed with it. And a couple of the viewers suggested that we should have an Alan Bishop reference in that shirt.
I saw that. That's awesome.
You'll notice that there's a Distillers Almanac book sitting on the apothecary bench, basically. So tip of the hat to Alan on that one, man.
I think that's awesome. I'm going to buy one.
No, you're not. I'll get you some. Don't worry. But that's a good point, man. This is hilarious. Normally I'm like, okay, cool. We've got like 3 minutes left. What do? Plug yourself. If I say that to Alan, it may take 45 minutes, but go for it, dude. Tell us where people can find more Alan Bishop products, media.
So for
Yeah.
the most part, you can find almost everything at thealchemistcabinet.com. But for what you guys are interested in, probably the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute on YouTube. I don't do a lot of process video stuff anymore. It's mostly just talking head. I'll answer your question sort of thing. But I am starting to do process videos from Old Homestead now. I just got to find somebody else to hold the camera while I actually work. Secondarily, you can check out, if you're at all into the paranormal, Fortean, High Strangeness. If you have Ghost, You Have Everything podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And then also the Distillers Talk podcast. We took a little break from that. Christy and I are starting to record again now. We interview distillers from around the world. Doesn't matter to us whether they're home distillers or legal distillers, illicit distillers, moonshiners. If you got a cool story and there's stuff I can learn from you, we'll bring you on the show. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out. We'd be glad to have you as well. And then, of course, Old Homestead, the new distillery. So oldhomesteaddc.com. Distillery and hotel, both. Distillery is not yet open, but it will be very shortly. And then I have to also mention Shriner Spirits. So Shriner Spirits is a rye whiskey and rye spirit based brand that I work on with my good friend Ken Shriner, based on his family history, going back to the 1880s with his great-great-grandfather distilling at several very prominent distilleries, including White Mills and Lindell, Seagram's and Shinley, etc., and reproducing as well as possible the rye whiskeys of that generation, as well as a rye-based gin. And I don't know the website because I'm a horrible partner. But you can look up Shriner
I'll stick it in the
Spirits.
show notes. Yeah. All right. Thanks heaps, Alan. We'll catch you next time,
brother.
mate.
Yeah.